The sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling hills of Northern Virginia when the first guests began arriving at Westbrook Military Academy. It was a brisk autumn morning, the kind that held its breath with quiet reverence. The banners lining the walkway were crisp blue and gold, each one bearing the emblem of the Academy's centennial celebration. Folding chairs had been arranged in perfect rows along the Great Quad. At the far end, a grand stage stood beneath the towering steps of the chapel, draped in flags and polished wood, ready to host senators, generals, and men in suits whose shoes had never known mud. Everything was immaculate, precise, rehearsed. Every movement was choreographed, every moment scheduled. And then, from the northern gate, the side no one used anymore, came the sound of slow, measured footsteps. They didn't belong to an escort team or a dignitary's entourage. They came from a single man. He walked with the aid of a wooden cane, its soft tap echoing against the cobblestone path. His coat was long, frayed at the edges, once olive but now faded into a dull gray. His shoulders slouched slightly with age, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. The kind that didn't need a stage or spotlight to stand tall. He paused at the edge of the quad where two junior officers stood guard. Both were sharp in uniform, postured with the crispness of protocol. One was tall, fair-skinned with the square jaw of a recruiting poster. The other, shorter, younger, still checking names on a digital tablet. They spotted the man approaching, and the taller one stepped forward with a polite nod. "Good morning, sir," he said, his tone firm but courteous. "May I see your credentials?" The man reached into his coat and slowly withdrew an old ID badge attached to a fraying lanyard. It looked like it had survived a war of its own. The plastic was yellowed, cracked at the edges, and the photo had nearly faded into a ghost. But one could still make out the words typed in bold black ink beneath the image, Westbrook Military Academy, Class of '44. The name beneath it read, Joseph Grant. He offered it to the lieutenant without a word, holding it gently, as if handing over a part of himself. The officer squinted at it, blinking. Sir, this ID isn't scannable. Do you have a QR code? A printed registration? This event requires verified access." Joseph Grant shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I just came to observe. I trained here. A long time ago." The younger officer glanced up from his tablet. "What's your name again, sir?" "Joseph Grant," he said calmly, then added, "Class 0. The younger man raised an eyebrow. "Class 0? "Sir, our records start at Class 1. I can't find anything under your name." "I didn't expect to be on any list," Joseph said with a quiet chuckle. "I came on foot. Just wanted to watch from a distance. Don't need a seat." The two officers exchanged glances. The taller one stepped closer and lowered his voice, trying to maintain professionalism. "Sir, this event is closed to the public. It's for invited guests and VIPs only. I'm afraid we can't let you pass this perimeter." Joseph looked past them, toward the distant stage now coming to life with dignitaries and cadets. His eyes didn't show anger, only understanding. "I suppose I've lived too long for the system to remember me," he said. "It's not that," the officer said quickly. "We just have strict security protocols." "I understand," Joseph replied. He returned the badge to his coat pocket, the motion slow but deliberate. "You're doing your job." There was no defiance in his tone, no wounded pride. Just the resignation of a man who had been overlooked too many times to count. He turned slowly, tapping his cane against the stone with each step as he walked away. The taller officer watched him go, jaw clenched. Something about the man stirred something deep in his gut. But protocol was protocol, and orders were orders. There was no place for uncertain guests at a ceremony being broadcast live to the nation. Joseph walked alone along the edge of the quad, past cadets checking communications, past sound crews adjusting mics, past rows of polished chairs waiting to be filled. He moved with a deliberate rhythm, steady despite the years that bent his spine. He passed the old fencing range where he once trained with sabers and bayonets. No one noticed. No one stopped him. He kept walking until he reached the farthest corner of the courtyard, beyond the camera's view, beyond the velvet ropes and security posts. There, between two tall hedges and beneath the rustling branches of an oak, was a low stone planter. He eased himself onto it with a slow exhale, setting his cane beside him. His knees ached, his back throbbed, but he didn't mind. He was close enough to see the flags, to hear the cadence of the marching band, to feel the spirit of the academy that once felt like home. Joseph pulled the badge from his coat again and looked at it. The plastic had peeled back at the corners, the ink almost gone, but he remembered. He remembered it all. The smell of gun oil and chalk dust. The sting of cold morning air on freshly shaved skin. The bark of the drill instructor yelling his name down the barracks hallway. The sound of boots in perfect rhythm. The night spent reading by flashlight under canvas tents. He remembered his brothers. 14 of them. Class 0. A pilot program. He remembered the ones who made it back. He remembered the ones who didn't. His eyes moved toward the podium. The stage lights flickered on. A brass band played softly in the background. No one noticed the old black man sitting alone at the edge of it all, badge in hand, watching silently. But he wasn't here to be noticed. He was here because he remembered. And before the day was done, so would they. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The badge lay in Joseph Grant's weathered hand like a relic from another world. Its corners were curled and brittle, the lamination clouded over time, and the once clear photograph had faded to a smudge. But to him, it wasn't just plastic and ink, it was proof that he'd been there when Westbrook was little more than a dream carved into stone and mud. Class 0. No one else used that phrase anymore, not in the official histories, not in the gleaming brochures handed out at recruitment events. But Joseph remembered it well. They were the original cadets, 14 black men selected quietly, without press or photos, in a time when the country still struggled to decide who it wanted to be. They had been placed in the West Barracks, a building that no longer stood, given bolt-action rifles and canvas cots, and trained with discipline so brutal and precise it carved them into legends. Legends without names. He rolled the badge between his fingers thoughtfully as the wind stirred the grass around the stone planter where he sat. The ceremony stage was coming alive now. Staff moved briskly across it, adjusting the podium, checking microphones, laying out medals and plaques in rows as if preparing for a coronation. Music floated softly on the air, patriotic, clean, reverent. It was the kind of day people would remember. The kind they would photograph and post, print in glossy newsletters and pin to bulletin boards. But they wouldn't remember him. Not unless someone told them. Joseph's eyes drifted to the two young lieutenants who had turned him away. They had gone back to their post near the entrance, standing at ease but alert, scanning every ID card with mechanical precision. He didn't blame them. They were doing exactly what they'd been trained to do. Follow protocol. Trust the list. Trust the scanner. But protocol didn't have a memory. It didn't recognize the lines on a man's face or the ache in his knees from 50 years of marching and kneeling in trenches. Protocol couldn't understand what it meant to stand on the soil you helped raise and be treated like a stranger. Joseph had tried earlier that morning to get through. Before the security perimeter was fully locked down, before the bustle reached a fever pitch, he had approached one of the registration tables. The cadets working there were sharp, young, bright-eyed, and stiff with responsibility. He had smiled when he walked up, holding his badge loosely between his fingers like an old photograph. "Excuse me, son," he'd said to the nearest cadet, a boy with a tight haircut and eyes full of ambition. "I'm hoping to check in." The cadet had paused, momentarily thrown off by the approach. "Name, sir. Joseph Grant, he said, then added, Class 0. The cadet furrowed his brow. Sir, the records begin with Class 1. That's 1924. Joseph had chuckled softly. That's because Class 0 wasn't official. 14 of us, assigned to a pilot program. We were quartered in the Old West Barracks. Trained with bolt-action rifles, bayonets, and wooden sabers. Dug latrines by hand and built firing pits before the first chapel stone was laid. The cadet stared at him, expression unreadable, and then asked, "Do you have a QR code or printed confirmation for today's event?" Joseph had held up his badge and simply said, "This is all I've got left." Before the cadet could reply, a supervising officer approached. Captain Landon, a clean-shaven man in his 30s with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, stepped into the conversation. "Is there an issue here, cadet?" he asked. The cadet gestured toward Joseph. "He says he's from Class 0, sir. Not in the registry." Joseph looked the captain in the eye. "I was here when those towers were built. Helped dig the first trenches behind the mess hall. Later, I served in Korea, 2 tours. When I returned, I helped launch the first recon training unit. We called it Spectre back then. Laid the foundation for what you now call special operations." Captain Landon raised an eyebrow. "With all due respect, sir, none of that matches our official records. If such a program existed, we'd have documentation." Joseph had nodded slowly. "It was classified. We didn't advertise it." The captain smiled, polite, but tight. The kind of smile that said the conversation was over. "Without proper documentation or confirmation, I'm afraid we can't allow you access beyond the public areas. Security protocol." Joseph had nodded again, gently, as if he'd expected it. But even then, he'd heard the young officer behind him mutter something not so quietly, "Maybe someone's grandpa got confused again." He had heard it. He always did. Still, he straightened his coat, tipped his head respectfully, and walked away. No confrontation. No plea. Just the silent weight of being unseen, of being erased from a place you helped build. Now, sitting alone on the stone planter with the badge in hand, Joseph watched as the stage filled with polished shoes and decorated uniforms. From a distance, he could see medals glinting on chests, flags rippling in cadence with the band. Cadets, lined in perfect formation, moved like clockwork through the quad. Among them, he spotted a young woman, sharp posture, eyes alert, moving with the grace of someone who knew where she belonged. She glanced once in his direction, and for a second, their eyes met. But then the moment passed, and she turned back toward the stage. Joseph rubbed the edge of the badge again. It didn't need a barcode to tell his story. It had survived dust storms in Texas, monsoon rains in Korea, and the slow erosion of memory. He wasn't angry that no one recognized him. He was just tired. Tired of being seen as a relic when he'd once been a cornerstone. Tired of explaining things that no longer fit neatly into folders or files. The ceremony would start soon. The cameras would roll. Speeches would be made. Traditions would be honored. And Joseph would sit quietly at the edge of it all, watching with the same pride and pain he had carried for over 70 years. He didn't come to be honored. He didn't even come to be seen. He came to remember. And maybe, just maybe, to be remembered. Joseph Grant let his gaze drift across the academy grounds, his dark eyes catching on every detail that still stood after all these years. The chapel's spire gleamed in the morning light just as it had when he helped lay down the foundation stone. The cobblestone paths were newer, but he remembered when they were little more than muddy trails between tents. He shifted on the stone planter beneath him and winced softly as a sharp jolt ran up his left knee. That leg had never fully healed after the fall in Cambodia, but he'd stopped complaining about pain decades ago. He breathed slowly, letting the air fill his lungs, and closed his eyes for a moment as the wind carried with it faint echoes from a different era. He could hear them, the sounds of a younger Westbrook. Cadets shouting cadence, boots pounding in unison on frozen ground, instructors barking commands with a steel-tipped tongue. His memory painted the picture clearly, sharper than any camera ever could. There were only 14 of them in Class 0, all black, all chosen not because the nation was ready for them but because someone in a quiet office somewhere thought it was time to experiment. No press. No glory. Just a dusty barracks, worn uniforms, and expectations so high they scraped the sky. He remembered the first night vividly. The barracks were drafty, the wooden floorboards groaned, and the wind howled through the cracks like a ghost determined to chase them back home. But they stayed. They stayed because they were told they didn't belong. They stayed because every insult hurled their way became fuel. And in Joseph's case, he stayed because he had nowhere else to go. He'd left the cotton fields of Georgia behind with nothing but a duffel bag in the name of a place that promised transformation. He had found it here, not in ceremonies or speeches, but in the silence between gunfire and the stillness after a successful march. He opened his eyes slowly, returning to the present. The field was filled now with polished boots and pressed uniforms. Rows of cadets lined the quad with perfect posture, their eyes fixed on the stage ahead. Brass instruments gleamed in the sunlight, warming up with ceremonial notes. Joseph's gaze fell to the fencing range beyond the chapel. It had been rebuilt since he last saw it, now enclosed with modern steel and synthetic flooring, but he still remembered the old one, the smell of sweat and sawdust, the sting of a missed parry, the rush of victory when he finally bested Sergeant Tolliver in a practice bout. Back then, the sabers were heavier, the matches longer, and respect had to be earned one bruise at a time. His hand absent-mindedly drifted to his ribs. There was still a faint ridge there from the day he took a blade to the side because he refused to yield. He hadn't been trying to prove anything to anyone else that day. Only to himself. That he could be more than what the world told him he was. That he could belong in a place that had never been built for him. He had been a soldier long before he ever picked up a weapon. Life had trained him harder than any drill sergeant ever could. The noise of the present rose again. A voice on a loudspeaker announced the beginning of the centennial ceremony. Joseph watched as guests took their seats in neat rows. Men and women in crisp suits and gowns, military brass adorned with medals and ribbons so heavy they seemed to bend their shoulders. He wondered how many of them actually knew the real story of Westbrook. Not the one in the brochures or promotional videos, but the one that started in the mud, in the shadows, in the quiet discipline of men who were never meant to be remembered. He looked down at his cane. The wood was smooth where his fingers had worn it down, but it still held firm. Just like him. His coat rustled in the breeze, and he reached once more for the badge inside. It was ridiculous, in a way, this small, faded thing that no one else could read. But to him, it meant everything. It was the proof that he had been here, had walked these paths when the trees were young and the building still echoed with construction dust. Across the quad, a group of cadets rehearsed their drill one final time before the ceremony began in earnest. Joseph watched them carefully. Their movements were clean, practiced, but he could tell who had it in their blood and who was still faking it. One cadet in particular, a young man with broad shoulders and precise steps, reminded him of his old friend Elijah. Elijah had been the loud one, the joker, the guy who could break tension with a single grin, but also the one who could lead under fire without blinking. Elijah never made it back from his second tour. Joseph had carried that weight longer than he cared to admit. He blinked hard, clearing the sting from his eyes. The past had a way of bleeding into the present if you stared too long. He let out a slow breath and let the noise of the ceremony wash over him again. Applause rippled across the field as a well-dressed speaker took the stage. Joseph couldn't hear what was being said. He didn't need to. The words were familiar: honor, courage, legacy, tradition. He had spoken them himself once, in dusty classrooms and quiet barracks, teaching younger soldiers how to move, how to think, how to survive. He had never needed a podium. His lessons had been written in sweat and sacrifice. A small group of cadets walked past the hedges not far from where he sat. None of them noticed him. He didn't call out. Instead, he watched them go, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. They were the future now. He was content being a shadow. Still, a small ache stirred in his chest. Not the ache of being forgotten, that was something he had long made peace with, but the ache of knowing that the stories that mattered most were the ones least likely to be told. He leaned back slightly and looked up at the sky. The sun was climbing higher, pushing aside the last veil of morning mist. The wind shifted, warmer now, and with it came a single, clear memory. The last day of training in Class 0. The 14 of them standing shoulder to shoulder, their boots caked in mud, their uniforms damp with rain. Sergeant Tolliver had walked down the line, stopping in front of each man with a hard stare and a nod of approval. When he reached Joseph, he had paused just a second longer. "You're a ghost, Grant," he had said. "Move like one. Fight like one. Be the last thing they never see coming." Joseph had never forgotten those words. Even now, sitting in the middle of a ceremony that didn't know his name, he was still that ghost. Watching. Remembering. Waiting. Cadet Lieutenant Emily Rhoda stood tall in the second row of the honored cadet formation, her hands clasped behind her back, boots perfectly aligned with the edge of the white chalk line that marked the forward boundary of the field. Her uniform was flawless, creased sharply, ribbons displayed in regulation order, and her beret tucked neatly beneath her left epaulette. She had earned every stitch. Top of her class in field tactics, leader of her recon team, and already pre-selected for early consideration at Ranger School. Her instructors called her precise, her peers called her intense, and she held herself to a standard higher than either group expected. She didn't miss much. And she certainly didn't miss the old man sitting just outside the ceremony zone. She'd first noticed him during the opening call for colors. While the crowd rose and turned their attention toward the chapel steps where the honor guard emerged with flags aloft, she had glanced toward the far hedges, instinctively scanning the perimeter like she always did before a field op. Her eyes paused on the figure seated alone near the stone planter just beyond the final row of folding chairs. He wasn't moving like a spectator eager for pomp and pageantry. He wasn't craning for a photo or fumbling with a program. He simply sat still, his gaze fixed straight ahead with a calmness that felt almost reverent. When the anthem played, he stood slowly, one hand on a cane, the other rising in a slow, practiced salute. His arms shook, but the angle was perfect, the posture undeniable. That wasn't the movement of a lost civilian or confused grandfather. That was the kind of salute you couldn't fake. That was muscle memory born of repetition, of discipline etched deep into the bones. Emily returned her gaze to the ceremony, but her mind kept drifting back to him. Something about the way he moved tugged at her gut. It wasn't his age or even the faded coat that looked like it had survived 3 wars. It was the way he watched, not with awe or curiosity, but with recognition. Like someone watching home from across a locked window. She wanted to believe she was wrong. Maybe he was just a retired instructor or a neighbor with a fondness for tradition. Maybe he'd stumbled onto the edge of the event by accident. But she knew instinct. She trusted her gut more than she trusted forms or titles, and her gut was telling her this man didn't come here for nostalgia. He came because he had a right to be here. When the master of ceremonies began reading the official list of honored guests, Emily leaned slightly toward her squad leader, a young captain from the Reserve Officer Training Corps. He was adjusting his cufflinks and squinting at the glare from the stage's polished podium. "Sir," she said quietly. He glanced over, distracted. "Yes, cadet. There's an elderly man seated near the rear hedges. He's not within the official seating or escorted. But I believe he may be prior service, possibly a former graduate." The captain looked where she indicated, his eyes narrowing. "Lots of vets here today, cadet. This is a centennial ceremony. If he's not on the list, he's not cleared. Eyes forward. Emily hesitated. Sir, I think he may have been part of an early training program. His posture. His salute. And I saw an academy badge around his neck. Old. Faded. It might predate our current records. The captain sighed and waved one hand dismissively. Cadet, we've got senators in the front row, generals preparing to speak, and the secretary of the Army's liaison team watching this like a hawk. You want me to investigate a guy sitting on a flower box? She met his gaze without flinching. Yes, sir. I do. He narrowed his eyes, annoyed. I'll make a note. But don't cause a scene. We don't need distractions today. Understood, sir, she said. She nodded and returned her gaze to the stage, but she didn't forget. She didn't sit down. Not yet. The ceremony moved forward with smooth precision. Speakers rotated up and down the steps with practiced cadence. Stories were told, medals were awarded, cadets were praised. But Emily kept looking back toward the hedges, stealing glances when she could, watching the old man who no one else seemed to notice. He hadn't moved much. Just sat there with his hands resting on the top of his cane, his back curved with age but not bent in spirit. His coat fluttered slightly in the breeze, and the ID badge on his chest caught the sun for a moment, revealing what looked like a grainy black and white photo. He didn't fidget. He didn't clap or smile at the speeches. He simply observed. And the more she watched him, the more certain she became that he wasn't a guest, wasn't an intruder, and certainly wasn't confused. He was something else entirely. A presence. A witness. A living fragment of something older than the podium, older than the flag banners, maybe even older than the stone chapel itself. And yet no one had made space for him. No one had asked his name. He sat on the edges of legacy like a ghost trapped between eras. The band launched into another hymn, and the cadets stiffened their posture as dignitaries applauded a recent donation. But Emily barely heard the words. Her mind was moving, calculating, questioning. Who was he? Why had no one noticed? And more importantly, why was she the only one who cared? She'd grown up believing that legacy was more than names on plaques or years carved into marble. It was about the hands that built things. The sweat behind the stories. And she had the distinct feeling that whoever that man was, he had helped build something no one remembered. When the applause faded and the next speaker stepped up to the microphone, she made her decision. She wouldn't interrupt the ceremony. She wouldn't draw attention. But when the time came, when the final speech ended and the cameras turned off, she was going to find out who he was. Because if the institution had forgotten him, someone needed to remember. And it might as well start with her. Long before the official procession began, Joseph Grant had made one final attempt to enter through the front. It was early, before the quad buzzed with cameras and ceremony, while the dew still clung to the blades of grass and the stage lights hadn't yet warmed up. He had arrived with hope, modest and steady, tucked neatly beneath his battered coat like a secret he had carried too long. He approached the eastern side of the parade grounds, where cadets in pressed uniforms were setting up folding tables and checking clipboards. There was no music yet, no crowds. Just the clink of folding chairs, the crisp murmur of instructions, and the quiet tap of his cane against the pavement. He waited patiently in line behind a small group of guests, most of them holding printed invitations or scanning phones with bright QR codes. Joseph had neither. When it was finally his turn, a young cadet with tight posture and eager eyes looked up and offered a polite nod. "Good morning, sir. May I see your registration?" Joseph smiled faintly and pulled the old badge from his coat, holding it out gently. The cadet hesitated, then leaned forward, squinting at the worn plastic, clearly unsure how to respond. "This is all I have," Joseph said quietly. "Name's Joseph Grant. Class 0. The cadet blinked. "Class 0? That's right," Joseph said. There were only 14 of us. First batch to ever train here. Before the record started. We lived in the West Barracks, long gone now, and trained with canvas gear and bolt-action rifles. It was a trial run. I suppose most folks wouldn't remember. The cadet scrolled through a digital list, frowning slightly. Sir, our archives begin with Class 1. 1924. I know, Joseph nodded. We were unofficial. They didn't put our names in the yearbooks. But I was here. I helped build the original trench system behind the mess hall. I can tell you which trees used to stand at the west perimeter before they poured concrete for the firing range. The cadet shifted uncomfortably. Do you have any printed credentials? Or perhaps a QR code sent to your phone? Joseph's smile didn't falter. Phones weren't around when I started here. Before the cadet could speak again, an officer nearby took notice and stepped over. Captain Landon, lean, stern-faced, clipboard in hand, his movements clipped and efficient. He was the kind of officer who measured respect in documents, not in stories. Is there a problem here, cadet? He asked. The cadet straightened. Sir, this gentleman claims to be from a class not in our registry. He's presenting an outdated badge. Captain Landon looked at Joseph, his eyes flicking over the coat, the cane, the quiet dignity that seemed out of place in a setting obsessed with sharp lines and clean angles. I served here, Joseph said simply. Class 0. Later did 2 tours in Korea. Came back in '61 to help train what eventually became the Academy's recon unit. Back then we called it Project Spectre. Spectre? Landon repeated, skeptical. Joseph nodded. It wasn't public. It was classified. We didn't wear patches or take pictures. We just trained, and then we deployed. The captain's brow furrowed. With all due respect, sir, our official history contains no mention of such a unit. And if the program was classified, we wouldn't have any record of it to verify your claim. Without documentation or clearance, I'm afraid we can't allow you into the restricted area. I understand, Joseph replied, voice calm. I figured I'd try anyway. I'm sure your service was honorable, Landon added, trying to soften the moment. But this event is for verified alumni and VIPs. There are security measures in place. I'm sure you understand. Joseph glanced past the officer, toward the rows of chairs now being arranged in perfect order, toward the chapel steps that once echoed with his own boots. Then he looked back at the officer, eyes calm, unreadable. I understand, he said again. It was then that another officer nearby muttered, not quite quietly enough, probably another confused old-timer. Happens every year. Joseph heard it. The way it was meant to land. Not cruel, but dismissive. Like a man misplacing his memories was somehow less deserving of being heard. He didn't react. He simply gave a polite nod to both men, turned, and walked away. His cane tapped against the stone with every step, a steady metronome to the silence that followed. No one called after him. No one asked if he needed help. He had been denied entry not once, but twice, and each time it had stripped a little more weight from a life already heavy with silence. He circled the long way around the quad, passing buildings whose facades had changed but whose bones he still recognized. The memorial archway that now bore names in gold lettering had once been an empty gateway when he passed through it as a 19-year-old. The mess hall now gleaming with digital screens had once served grits and black coffee by the gallon. He paused at a bronze statue of a mounted officer near the administration building. The base read, in honor of the founding classes. His name wasn't there. He didn't stop to look long. He simply walked past, stepping lightly across the lawn where cadets rehearsed in tight drill formations. None of them turned their heads. None of them saw him. But he saw them. Their movements were sharp. Their cadence clean. Their posture disciplined. He recognized all of it, because he had taught it. Before there were manuals or field handbooks or simulation labs, he had walked the field with a whistle around his neck and fire in his chest. Joseph found his place again at the edge of the hedges, returning to the planter where he had first rested. He sat down slowly, hands on his knees, cane beside him, breath steady. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He had long learned that time had a way of erasing what didn't fit neatly into the narrative. But even erasure couldn't undo the truth. He didn't need applause or medals. He didn't come for recognition. He came to see the place once more. To remember. To be close to the ground he had bled for. And as he sat quietly in the shade of the oaks, the ceremony moved on without him. But the academy had no idea it was being watched by one of its original ghosts. A man who had returned not to be honored, but simply not to be forgotten. The sound of distant drums echoed through the quad, sharp and ceremonial, but Joseph Grant didn't hear them. Not really. His eyes were fixed on the chapel, though his mind was far from it, drifting backward through decades of dust and silence to the time when the world still called him sergeant, then lieutenant, then simply Spectre. That name wasn't a call sign, not officially. It had been born of whispered respect from young recruits who didn't understand how someone could move like smoke and hit like thunder. The name stuck, and so did the legend, though not in the record books. Legends like his never made it into the official history. They lived in the breath between orders, in missions that never happened, and in the ghosts of operations classified so deeply they may as well have never existed. Spectre Company was real, even if no one at today's ceremony would admit it. Joseph had been there at its inception. After Korea, when the Department of Defense began quietly experimenting with asymmetrical warfare doctrine, they looked for instructors who could teach survival, infiltration, and recon at the edge of human endurance. Joseph was one of the first to answer the call. He didn't wear medals for that. He didn't attend press briefings or ceremonies. What he did was take green cadets into the woods, strip them down to their fear, and rebuild them into soldiers who could operate when radios died and maps became worthless. Westbrook called it advanced field tactics. Internally, they called it Spectre. He remembered the first training cycle vividly. It was the summer of 1962, and the academy was still hesitant to admit it needed something beyond its polished drills and textbook doctrine. Joseph had spent weeks sleeping in the tree line behind the barracks, watching how cadets moved, what they missed. When the official approval came to begin the program, he didn't wait for chalkboards or classrooms. He walked into the yard one morning with a rucksack and said, "The ones who follow me into the woods will come out different. The ones who don't follow, don't belong." 12 cadets followed. Only 8 finished. The others quit or were pulled out for medical reasons. The terrain was unforgiving, but Joseph was harder. He taught them how to navigate without compasses, how to live off the land, how to move silently through enemy terrain. He taught them what fear sounded like when it tried to pretend it wasn't there. And he taught them that the only thing louder than a gunshot was the silence that followed if you failed. Those early days were a crucible, and Joseph never once raised his voice. He didn't have to. His presence alone commanded discipline. He moved like he had been carved out of the land itself, his footsteps falling where noise refused to follow. He once tracked a deserter for 6 hours through swamp and brush, not to punish him, but to return him without anyone noticing he had ever left. When that cadet graduated, he said Joseph had saved his life twice, once by dragging him back, and once by not telling anyone why. By the mid-60s, Spectre Company became the unofficial backbone of what would later become the Joint Reconnaissance Doctrine. The Army called it foundational. The Navy copied it. The Marines tried to outdo it. But it all began with a quiet black man and 12 cadets in the hills behind Westbrook. No one remembered that now. Joseph didn't expect them to. He had never asked for credit, never posed for photos. He had seen too much in the world to trust applause. But he also knew that the principles he taught had saved lives, hundreds, maybe thousands. Not because of what they memorized, but because of what they became. There were operations too sensitive to be recorded. Missions behind enemy lines in places that didn't officially exist. He had led a 3-man team into Laos to extract a downed pilot. No support, no radio contact, just boots and blood. He had held the hand of a dying 19-year-old under moonlight and promised to tell his mother he'd gone out a warrior. He never got the chance. The mission was scrubbed. The body was never recovered. The report was sealed. Another ghost for the Spectre ledger. Joseph breathed in deeply, the scent of cut grass and burning sunlight snapping him back to the present. His fingers flexed slightly against the handle of his cane, remembering the way they once gripped steel in combat. They had trembled now and then, but not from fear. From restraint. He had never allowed rage to guide him, even when he had every right to feel it. Not during boot camp when officers refused to look him in the eye because of his skin, not during his first combat tour when he was denied promotion 3 times despite leading units out of ambushes that would have swallowed others whole. He didn't need their titles. He had his own code. Move like a ghost. Fight like a storm. Leave no footprint but the truth. It struck him now how quiet the academy had become in spirit, how much louder everything else seemed in comparison. The ceremony was still in full swing, with speeches echoing across loudspeakers and cameras capturing every polished smile. But the silence in Joseph's corner felt sacred, untouched by the pageantry. It was here, in this quiet place near the hedges, that real memory lived. The kind not framed or engraved. The kind that grew in the earth and refused to be buried. He wondered briefly how many of today's cadets even knew the origin of their field manual. Did they know the man who had first taught low-profile movement had done so under fire, crawling through jungle mud with a map burned into his head? Did they know the evasion drills they practiced were born from real chases, real blood, real desperation? Probably not. And maybe that was the way it had to be. But still, it tugged at him. Not bitterness. Just the simple ache of truth untold. A soft breeze swept through the field, rustling the trees above and whispering across the shoulders of the gathered crowd. Joseph looked up for a moment, watching the sky as clouds shifted across the sun. It reminded him of the last night before his final deployment, when the stars had looked exactly like this. One of his cadets had asked him then, "What's it like to be invisible?" Joseph had smiled and replied, "Only the world forgets what it cannot see. We don't forget ourselves." He hadn't. Not once. And now, though the world moved without him, though the speeches flowed without his name, he sat in his silence like a monument that no one had commissioned. A man whose legacy walked in shadows, and whose story waited in the quiet to be found again. Cadet Lieutenant Emily Rhoda stood with her hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the row of brass insignias adorning the stage. The speakers had changed, and the voices behind the podium had shifted from polished cadets to decorated generals. Each speech was filled with pride, tradition, and curated memory. The audience responded on cue, applause rolling like a drumbeat. But Emily heard none of it clearly. Her mind was still with the man at the edge of the hedges, the one no one had acknowledged, the one she couldn't stop thinking about. Something about him lingered in her gut like a truth she hadn't yet uncovered. She had been trained to trust her instincts. In every simulation, every field scenario, every classroom discussion, she had learned that the moment you dismissed your gut was the moment you invited regret. She scanned the crowd again, trying to find his outline through the movement of staff and guests. There he was, sitting still, the only person outside the perimeter who hadn't shifted an inch in over an hour. His posture hadn't relaxed. His eyes hadn't drifted. He sat like a sentinel, a presence rooted in something older than the event itself. She didn't know why the weight of his presence bothered her so much, but it did. Deeply. She waited until the applause died down again and leaned toward her ROTC captain, lowering her voice. "Sir, about the man near the hedges, he's still there. Still watching. Still hasn't moved." The captain didn't look away from the stage. And I think he might be prior service, maybe even a former graduate, she said. He's wearing an old academy badge, one I've never seen before. Now the captain turned, just enough to glance her way, irritation sharpening his expression. Cadet Rhodes, I thought we already covered this. I know, sir, she replied, carefully measured. But I believe he could be part of the academy's early history. He carries himself like someone who's trained here, really trained. His salute during the anthem was textbook. No hesitation, no uncertainty. And the way he watches, he knows what he's looking at. He knows the order, the form, the tempo. He's not confused. He's remembering. The captain exhaled hard through his nose. We have distinguished guests from the Pentagon, 4-star generals, cabinet liaisons. The Secretary of the Army's representative is sitting 10 feet from the superintendent. Do you really want to derail protocol to investigate a man sitting on a flower box? Emily didn't flinch. I'm saying we owe it to the institution to find out who he is. If we're going to talk about legacy and honor, then maybe we should make sure we're not ignoring the people who actually built it. He turned fully toward her now, brow furrowed. That's not your call to make. Protocol exists for a reason. If the man didn't register, he doesn't belong inside the perimeter. We can't verify everyone who shows up with a story. I need your attention on the ceremony, not on phantom memories from the crowd. She nodded slowly, her jaw clenched. Understood, sir. Then keep your eyes forward. Dismissed. Emily returned to her position, but her mind didn't follow orders. Her eyes flicked once more toward the edge of the quad. The man was still there. His hands rested on his cane. His face was unreadable, but his presence said everything she needed to hear. He had the look of someone who had watched generations pass by from the same distance. Someone who knew he had been erased not by malice, but by bureaucracy and time. She remembered a quote from a field ethics lecture her second year: respect isn't just for rank. It's for sacrifice. And not all sacrifice fits neatly on a resume. At the time, it sounded like an empty phrase meant to check a leadership box. But now, standing among a sea of pressed uniforms and polished medals, it finally meant something. What good was honor if it only followed paperwork? She watched as a trio of VIPs were ushered through the center aisle. Their escorts saluted. Cameras clicked. Every movement felt staged. Every name called from the podium had been rehearsed for days. And yet, just a few yards away, the man who might have written the first chapter of the Academy's modern doctrine sat ignored. Forgotten by the institution he helped shape. She wondered how many others like him had been pushed to the margins over the years. How many men had served in silence, built systems, led missions, and returned home with nothing but ghosts and fading memory. Their names never spoken on days like this, their stories never framed behind glass. How many had waited quietly for someone, anyone, to look their way and say, I see you. The sun crept higher now, casting long shadows across the stage. A military band struck up a new melody. It was loud, triumphant, proud. Emily's stomach turned. Not because of the music, but because of what was missing. One chair in the back. One man. One badge that no scanner could read. She made a decision in that moment, silent but firm. If the institution wouldn't remember him, she would. If the system failed to verify his presence, she would verify it with her own eyes, her own judgment. And if that judgment cost her a reprimand, so be it. Some things were more important than polished shoes and uninterrupted schedules. She stood there in formation, unmoving, her gaze locked forward, but her mind already walking across the quad toward the truth. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know his story. But she would. One way or another, she would. And when the time came to speak about legacy, about history and honor, she would make sure his name would not be forgotten again. The moment the speaker behind the podium announced the Academy's commitment to honoring tradition, a chill swept through the quad that had nothing to do with weather. It came on like a subtle change in pressure, the kind of shift a seasoned soldier feels in his bones long before it registers in the air. Joseph Grant felt it first. Sitting alone beneath the rustling oak, he stopped watching the stage and turned his eyes to the sky. A low thrum trembled through the ground, faint at first, almost like a drumline warming up, but deeper and more constant. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong to any band, any music cue, or any part of the centennial schedule. Emily Rhodus felt it too. The bass of it vibrated in her boots, reverberating through the soles like a question waiting for an answer. She shifted slightly, eyes scanning past the VIPs, past the flagpoles, up into the horizon beyond the treetops where the morning sky had begun to brighten. At first, there was nothing. Then, like a ghost breaking through the fog of ceremony, it appeared. The outline was subtle at first, just a blur over the tree line, but as it drew closer, the silhouette sharpened into hard angles and unmistakable rotors. A helicopter. But not just any helicopter. The emblem was visible before the sound fully caught the crowd's attention. Painted on the side in dark navy and gold, the crest of Westbrook was flanked by unit markings known only to a few in the military hierarchy. These weren't parade units or VIP escorts. These were marks of distinction. Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Army Rangers. It wasn't just one branch. It was all of them. The best of the best. And none of it had been announced. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Guests turned in their seats. Cadets shifted their weight, eyes rising, posture uncertain. Even the master of ceremonies faltered, his voice catching over the microphone as he tried to keep the audience focused. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. This appears to be, a special demonstration arranged by our Alumni Affairs Committee, he said, his words stuttering over the static of confusion. But Emily could tell this wasn't a demonstration. The helicopter didn't circle. It didn't hover for effect. It came in fast, low, and precise, descending into the northern field with the grace of a practice strike team. The landing gear barely kissed the grass before the doors slid open. Out stepped 12 soldiers in full dress blacks, each wearing the insignia of a different elite unit. Their movements were silent, synchronized, flawless. They formed a line without command, their formation perfect, their presence commanding. But none of them moved toward the stage. Emily's heart pounded, but not from fear. It was awe. This wasn't a stunt. This was real. And whoever they were here for, it wasn't the general seated 3 rows from the front or the senator shaking hands near the bandstand. As the 12 warriors marched forward in unison, Emily followed their path with her eyes, and her breath caught. They were heading straight for the man at the edge of the hedges. Joseph Grant didn't rise at first. He watched them come like a man watching the past return in physical form. There was no fear, no surprise. Only the deep stillness of someone who knew exactly what was happening because he had once trained men to do the same thing. As they approached, he finally placed a hand on his cane and stood, slowly but steadily. The cane kept his balance, but his spine remained straight. When the lead soldier reached him, Joseph looked him in the eyes. The man removed his cap. A 4-star general. General Marcus Leland, commander of Joint Special Operations Command. Decorated veteran. Living legend. His name alone carried more weight than most medals. He stood in front of Joseph, surrounded by silence that had swallowed the entire quad. Then, with deliberate precision, Leland raised his right hand and delivered a formal salute. The world seemed to stop. Behind Leland, the 12 Special Forces operatives followed suit, each raising their hands in perfect unison. It wasn't a casual salute. It was crisp, military, reverent. A salute given not to rank, but to legacy. To something deeper than protocol. Emily's throat tightened. Her eyes prickled with heat. Around her, even the most hardened officers stood frozen, unsure of what they were witnessing. The cadets, the generals, the dignitaries, none of them were the center anymore. The ceremony had shifted, not by agenda, but by truth. Joseph returned the salute slowly, his hand trembling slightly, his fingers curled with age and arthritis. But the motion was pure, exact, without a single deviation. Honor lives in the bones, and his remembered. When he lowered his hand, General Leland turned to face the audience. No microphone was needed. His voice was low but thundered through the silence like a command that had waited too long. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his eyes sweeping across the sea of faces, "you've heard stories this morning of tradition, of discipline, of valor. But none of those would exist for us if not for this man." He gestured toward Joseph. "This is Colonel Joseph Grant. Class 0. Founding cadet of Westbrook Military Academy. Before there were dormitories, before there was a chapel, before Westbrook was a name in the world, he was here. And when the nation needed warriors to step into the shadows, to train the first of its special operations forces, he was the one who showed us how." The hush turned into something else then. Reverence. Cadets rose from their seats. Officers lowered their eyes. Dignitaries shifted awkwardly, unsure how they had missed a legacy that had stood at the edge of their vision all morning. Emily felt tears burn the corners of her eyes. She stood straighter than she ever had in her life. Joseph didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth had finally spoken for him. And for the first time in decades, the man who was always kept outside the rope stood at the very center of what he had built. Not because he asked for it, but because the truth had finally arrived. Not on the schedule, but exactly on time. Joseph stood in the silence that had swallowed the quad, the sun warming the crown of his head as if the skies themselves paused to bear witness. The moment wasn't rehearsed, and it wasn't gentle. It descended with the weight of years, with the rumble of a Blackhawk and the boots of warriors forged in every corner of the world. The 12 soldiers behind General Marcus Leland stood at perfect attention, faces locked forward, but their eyes, dark, focused, reverent, spoke volumes. They didn't just see an old man. They saw the spine of their heritage, a chapter of history that had never made it to print but had been carried in the marrow of their training, in the whispered stories between deployments, in the way they moved through the world when the world wasn't watching. Leland turned back toward Joseph, lowering his salute slowly, as if reluctant to release it. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Joseph hesitated for a moment, then took it, his grip firm, the kind of grip that said, "I still remember what it means to lead." Neither man spoke at first. They just looked at one another, a quiet exchange of memory and recognition passing between them, dense and wordless. When Leland finally spoke, his voice was low, but every cadet, every officer, and every civilian present felt it like a drumbeat in their chest. "You didn't come here to be seen," Leland said. "But we came to see you." Joseph's lips twitched into something between a smile and a nod. "Wasn't sure anyone would remember," he said. "We never forgot," Leland replied. "We just didn't know where to look." He turned again to the crowd. No one sat. No one moved. From the front rows to the rear hedges, they stood like statues. Even the wind had stilled. Leland lifted his voice without need of amplification. Colonel Grant served before records made room for his name. He trained before manuals were written. When others drafted theory, he wrote doctrine in the field with sweat, with silence, and sometimes with blood. The unit many of you know as the foundation of modern special operations, Spectre, began under his command. Not on paper, but in the woods. In the dark. In the unmarked corners of war. He gestured back toward the operatives standing in formation. Every soldier standing behind me trained under a lineage that began with him. Every mission we've accomplished, every life we've saved, every battle we've survived, he laid that groundwork. And we have come here today not to celebrate a century of the Academy, but to return that honor to the man who gave it form. Joseph didn't blink. He stood as if carved from stone, though Emily could see the tremble in his hand as it rested again on his cane. Her chest tightened. She had been right. She had seen what others refused to. And now the entire institution stood suspended in the gravity of what they had nearly missed. One of the younger soldiers in formation, a tall black man with ranger insignia on his sleeve, broke from rank without a word. He walked over to Joseph and handed him something. A patch. Spectre's insignia. Black cloth, silver thread, the outline of a shadow stepping through flame. Joseph held it like he was holding a piece of himself returned after a long exile. His thumb brushed over the edge, and for the first time since he arrived that morning, his eyes glistened. Not from sadness. From memory. Emily glanced toward her squad leader. The captain stood rooted, lips parted slightly, face pale with realization. He had not issued an order. No one had. But cadets across the quad began to stand, those who had been seated rising without prompt. Their hands went to their brows, salutes blooming in every direction, a field of respect raised in absolute silence. Not a single one looked to the stage. All eyes were on Joseph. The two lieutenants who had turned Joseph away earlier had moved to the back of the crowd. Now, like men waking from a long sleep, they began to push forward through the sea of uniforms. They came slowly, without fanfare, heads lowered. As they reached the edge of the perimeter, they paused, waiting. Joseph turned his gaze toward them, and for a long second, no one moved. Then the taller of the two stepped forward. His voice was quiet, but the hush around them made it carry. "Sir, we're sorry. Truly. We didn't know." Joseph studied him. He wasn't judging. He wasn't angry. But he looked, really looked, into the eyes of the young man who had once asked for a barcode where there was none. Then he nodded, a small, deliberate motion. No rebuke. No speech. Just grace. Behind them, the superintendent had risen from his seat. He approached the microphone with trembling hands. He cleared his throat once, then again, trying to find footing in a moment that no longer belonged to him. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Today, we've been reminded that history doesn't always wear a name tag. That some legacies live without banners, without footnotes, but leave deeper footprints than any parade ever could. Colonel Grant's service predates our digital records, but it built the foundation we stand on. He is not a footnote. He is the first sentence." Joseph looked away from the crowd then, turning back toward the quad, his eyes sweeping across the field that now stood at attention. The wind returned, soft, carrying the distant sound of the flag flapping at the top of its pole. He raised his hand one final time, not in salute, but in acknowledgement. Leland stood beside him, silent, shoulders squared. Around them, the formation of special operators remained still, their presence a tribute etched in posture. One by one, guests began to lower their heads. Some placed hands over hearts. Others wiped their eyes. And some simply stood very still, letting the weight of the moment settle into their bones. In the middle of it all, the man who had once trained shadows now stood illuminated. Not by spotlight. But by truth. The quad had never been this quiet. Not even during morning drills, not even when taps played at dusk. It was a silence that seemed to breathe, as if the entire academy was holding its breath in the presence of something sacred. General Marcus Leland stood shoulder to shoulder with Colonel Joseph Grant, but in every meaningful way, it was Leland who now stood in the shadow of the elder man. The ceremony, once orchestrated to showcase a century of disciplined tradition, had transformed into something far more intimate and raw. No script could have planned it, and no protocol could contain it. This was not a salute for an honored guest. It was a reckoning. Joseph stood with his hand still raised in acknowledgement, and the young officers across the field stood frozen, their eyes fixed on him like cadets facing their first command inspection. But Joseph didn't scan for attention or approval. His gaze drifted instead to the row of cadets closest to the flag, where young men and women in fresh uniforms looked as if they were seeing military history for the first time with unfiltered eyes. Not the kind of history carved in marble or printed in textbooks, but the kind that lived in blood, in breath, in silent rooms where decisions were made that no one ever spoke of again. General Leland broke the silence with slow, deliberate steps forward. He reached the center of the quad and turned to face the crowd. This time he didn't address them from behind a podium. He didn't wear a speech in his pocket. He simply looked out at the sea of cadets, officers, and guests, and said, "You've trained here under the banner of Westbrook. You've memorized names of generals and recited lines from our doctrine. But none of it would exist, not the courses, not the code, not even the combat training lanes, if it weren't for Colonel Grant." He turned to Joseph again, his voice heavy with restrained emotion. "This man taught me what it meant to lead. Not from a desk. Not from a classroom. But from behind enemy lines with no backup and no promise of survival. When I was a 22-year-old second lieutenant pinned down near the Cambodian border, I thought I was going to die. My comms were dead. My team was fractured. And I had given up. But then, like a damn ghost, he appeared out of the brush with 2 men behind him and no orders but his own grit. He led us 17 kilometers under fire. No medals. No headlines. Just 3 men alive because he refused to let us die." Joseph blinked slowly, his jaw set tight as Leland's voice carried across the open field. "I was 22, Leland continued. He was 50. And he didn't hesitate. He was the only reason I ever made it back to Westbrook. The only reason I became what I am today." He turned fully now, addressing the cadets directly. "What you train for, what you aspire to, comes from him. He taught the first recon unit this academy ever produced. They called it Spectre, not because it was secret, though it was, but because no one ever saw them coming. That's what he made. That's who he is." Joseph shifted slightly on his cane, but he remained upright, his back straight, the years seeming to fall away under the weight of the words being spoken. Around him, the crowd stood as if awaiting a command they would never receive. They didn't need one. They had already been moved into formation by something greater than orders. Leland stepped closer again and looked Joseph directly in the eye. "Sir, I came here to deliver a speech about tradition. But I now know I am not the one with anything worth saying. This day belongs to you. We came here to celebrate 100 years of this institution. But you, your legacy, was here before the first building was completed. Before the first cadet marched in step." He turned to his team, and with a nod, they stepped back, parting the way, forming a corridor of respect that led from the hedges where Joseph had stood alone all morning to the front row of dignitary seats. And then, with the precision of a drill long rehearsed, Leland stepped to one side, raised his hand once more, and gave Joseph a second salute. Not as a formality, but as a man acknowledging the source of his own courage. Joseph inhaled deeply. His hand rose once more to his brow, trembling but sure. The gesture carried with it every year he had lived, every battle he had survived, every quiet slight he had absorbed without bitterness. The salute wasn't just military. It was sacred. The entire formation followed suit. 12 warriors in black dress uniforms raised their hands in perfect unison. Emily felt the impact like a thunderclap in her chest. It wasn't loud. But it shook something loose. Something buried in her idea of what leadership looked like. Of what sacrifice truly meant. She watched Joseph hold the salute for a full 5 seconds, then lower it with the same deliberate grace that had carried him through war, through years of being forgotten, through the painful dignity of walking alone through a place he had helped build. And then he spoke. Not to the general. Not to the cadets. But to the space between them all. "I didn't come here to be seen," he said softly. "I came to remember." The words landed like a benediction. Leland stepped back. The salute dissolved. The special operations team returned to formation, but they didn't move. The quad remained hushed, still electrified by what had just happened. Joseph turned slightly and looked out over the crowd, his gaze pausing at familiar landmarks that had outlived so many faces. The chapel. The range. The tower. Then he looked back toward the cadets in the back rows, young, wide-eyed, uncertain, and utterly changed. Emily stood among them, her hand still hovering near her brow. Her eyes locked with his. He gave her the smallest nod, one that didn't need words. In that moment, Joseph Grant, Class 0, no longer stood at the margins of history. He stood at its center, surrounded not by noise, but by the sound of 1,000 hearts learning what honor really looked like. And for the first time since his boots had left the training ground all those years ago, he knew he was no longer alone. The morning light had shifted by the time Joseph lowered his hand, though the sun's rise felt secondary to the gravity that now anchored the field. The quad no longer buzzed with camera shutters or ceremonial chatter. There were no rustling programs, no stagehands adjusting microphones, no shuffling of bored dignitaries waiting for their turn at the podium. All of it had been eclipsed. It was as if time had recognized the weight of the moment and paused, offering one breathless silence to make space for something bigger than tradition. 1,000 eyes were locked on Joseph Grant, not because of what he wore, or where he sat, but because of what he had become, a man no longer hidden in the footnotes of history, but standing tall at its very front. The superintendent returned to the microphone slowly, like a man treading into sacred ground. He glanced down at his note cards, then placed them face down on the podium. When he spoke, it was without ceremony, without polish. "I don't believe anyone here expected today's centennial celebration to take this turn," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "And I can admit, I certainly didn't plan for this." He looked toward Joseph. "But sometimes the most important history is the kind that walks in quietly. No title. No spotlight. Just truth." The crowd didn't respond with applause. They didn't need to. Everyone understood. The only thing that mattered now was listening. The superintendent continued, his eyes scanning the formation of cadets and officers standing at full attention. "You've heard names today. Founders. Donors. Distinguished graduates. But the name we nearly left out is the one that should have led every program handed out this morning. Colonel Joseph Grant was not only part of the first experimental class at Westbrook. He helped define what this academy would become. And he did so without ever asking for credit, without demanding recognition, and without his name etched in stone. There was a pause as the superintendent's voice thickened. He cleared his throat once, then gestured toward the cadet honor guard. Colonel Grant led what was once known only as Project Spectre, the precursor to the very special operations training pipeline that we pride ourselves on today. His field tactics, his resilience, his instinct, those were the foundation. But what he truly taught us was something this academy sometimes forgets to name. He taught us humility. Quiet strength. Service without spotlight. Joseph stood motionless, but in his eyes, there was a glint of something new, not pride, but relief. The kind of relief that comes only after years of being unseen, when the world finally remembers the thread you wove into its fabric. The superintendent stepped away from the microphone and nodded to two cadets stationed near the flagpole. With measured precision, they moved to a large navy banner concealed by white draping. As they pulled the covering away, gasps rippled through the crowd. Stitched in gold thread across the banner was a new designation, the Joseph Grant Training Center, established 2024. Emily's heart leapt as she read the lettering. She looked around at the others, seeing jaws slacken and eyes widen. In an instant, the legacy of Spectre was no longer a ghost story whispered between old soldiers. It had been made permanent. Visible. Real. The cadets lowered the banner into place, its edges catching the breeze, fluttering softly above the crowd. Joseph blinked slowly, absorbing the sight. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't come for his name to be on a banner or a building. But now that it wasn't vanity he felt. It was closure. The kind that reaches deep, down to the parts of a man where sacrifice is stored and seldom spoken. General Leland stepped beside him again, speaking quietly. "It should have happened a long time ago," he said. "But it happens today because your story outlasted silence." Joseph nodded once. "I didn't keep it for them. I kept it for the ones who didn't make it back." Leland's gaze dropped, solemn. "They're here too, Colonel." Joseph didn't reply. He didn't need to. His eyes found the patch still folded in his hand, the black cloth, the silver thread, the insignia of Spectre. His thumb traced the outline once more before slipping it gently into the breast pocket of his coat. It wasn't for display. It was where it had always belonged, close to his heart. Across the quad, cadets began murmuring to one another, not with distraction but with awe. They would talk about this moment for years, some their entire lives. One of them, maybe several, would look back one day when standing in a foreign place with danger just beyond the next ridge, and remember the way an old man stood unshaken at the center of 1,000 eyes and never once asked to be acknowledged. Emily remained still, her fingers twitching at her side as if trying to write the moment into her skin. She glanced again at the chair Joseph had sat in before the formation descended. Now it was empty, a quiet sentinel in its own right, marking where a man had waited not to be seen, but simply to remember. She felt something shift in her, an unspoken vow forming without permission. She would never forget this. She would carry it forward. She would teach it, live it, and pass it on. As the wind rustled again, this time catching the edges of the new banner and sending it snapping softly above the crowd, Joseph turned back toward the podium. The superintendent stepped forward once more and said the words that would echo long after the ceremony had ended. "Colonel Grant, on behalf of every cadet, every graduate, every soldier shaped by this academy, we remember. And from this day forward, we will never forget." There was no need for applause. There was only stillness, reverence, and the quiet sense that something once hidden had finally been restored to its rightful place. And as Joseph Grant looked out across the quad one last time, he didn't see a crowd. He saw echoes of the men he'd trained, the missions they'd lived through, the legacy he never asked to keep but never let go. The ghosts of Spectre stood with him, not behind him, but beside him. Finally, in the light. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The words spoken from the podium still echoed faintly in the morning air as Joseph Grant stepped away from the center of the quad, his cane steady beneath him, the patch tucked securely in his breast pocket. His steps were measured, his face composed, but in his mind, the ceremony dissolved into silence and another memory came forward with startling clarity. The jungle wasn't here in Virginia, but it might as well have been, rising around him with oppressive heat and thick vines, the canopy above filtering daylight into a green haze. His body was back on the field at Westbrook, but his soul was deep in the Cambodian highlands, surrounded by shadows and gunfire, 17 kilometers behind enemy lines. It had been the spring of 1971, just weeks before his quiet retirement. Joseph hadn't planned to take part in another mission. He was 50 years old, his knees already aching from years of wear, his reflexes not quite as sharp as they once were. He had spent the last few years overseeing the expansion of Spectre training, slowly handing off his role to younger instructors, embedding the principles of silent movement and intuitive strategy into the marrow of the academy. But that day, something changed. An intel team, 3 young men barely old enough to shave, had gone missing in the northern hills of Cambodia. A failed recon mission, communications severed, backup delayed indefinitely. The brass had already begun preparing condolence letters. Joseph had been in the planning tent when the report came in. The coordinates were grainy, the intel incomplete, but he knew the terrain. He'd trained in those hills. He knew the ridgelines, the river crossings, the bamboo traps laid by locals who didn't take sides but wanted every intruder to bleed. And he knew, instinctively, that if someone didn't move fast, those 3 boys were dead. He didn't wait for clearance. He didn't ask for a team. He picked 2 men he trusted, packed what he needed, and disappeared into the green. The mission wasn't recorded in the official logbooks. No flight manifest bore their names. They moved at night, under cover of rain and foliage, each step a calculation between silence and survival. Joseph led from the front, as he always had, reading the land like a map etched into his bones. He could still recall the taste of sweat on his upper lip, the tension in his spine as they crawled under tripwires, the flinch in his gut when a distant pop signaled gunfire. He could also remember the moment they found the first soldier, Private First Class Nolan, face bloodied, leg twisted at an unnatural angle but alive. Huddled beside him was Lieutenant Marcus Leland, eyes alert but scared in a way he hadn't yet learned how to hide. The 3rd man, Corporal Jenkins, had been shot in the shoulder and was losing blood quickly. There was no time to plan. No way to radio for extraction. So Joseph hoisted Jenkins across his shoulders, nodded to the others, and began the long journey back. They moved through the jungle like ghosts, hugging low terrain, using every trick Joseph had ever taught his cadets. When enemy scouts drew near, they froze, breathing so shallow it felt like drowning in air. Once, they had to submerge themselves in a river for nearly 5 minutes, only their eyes above the surface as a patrol moved along the opposite bank. Jenkins had passed out, blood still seeping into Joseph's collarbone. At one point, Leland slipped, and the noise nearly brought a rain of gunfire down on them. Joseph had grabbed him, pulled him under a fallen tree, and pressed a hand over his mouth until the danger passed. They moved for 17 hours without pause, crossing ridges, avoiding open trails, retracing a route Joseph hadn't seen in nearly a decade. When they finally broke the tree line and emerged into the clearing where a field medic team had been scrambled, Joseph didn't wait for thanks. He handed off Jenkins, pointed to Leland, and collapsed to his knees. Not from fatigue, but from release. He had done what he came to do. Again. And no one, not even the jungle, had stopped him. Now, standing again in the present, Joseph looked out across the academy's field and saw not polished shoes and gold braids but the faint silhouettes of men who had walked behind him in that jungle. He saw the flash of a blade in the dark, the flicker of fear in a young soldier's eyes before discipline took hold. He remembered the feel of the earth beneath his boots, the weight of someone else's life on his back. And he remembered the moment Leland had looked at him, days later, in the infirmary, and whispered, "I thought I knew what courage was. But you taught me something else. You taught me what it means to keep going when no one knows you're still out there." He hadn't wanted praise. He had barely spoken of that mission since. It was just another entry in the long, invisible journal of his service. But standing here now, as Leland addressed the crowd with his name on his lips and the truth of that day finally revealed, Joseph felt something shift inside. Not pride. Not ego. But peace. A deep, soul-stilling peace that came only when the world finally saw not just what you had done, but why you had done it. He turned his head slightly and caught Emily Rodas watching him from the cadet line. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes shimmered with something unmistakable, understanding. She knew now. She had seen what many hadn't. She had felt the presence of something ancient, something sacred, long before the helicopter touched down. He gave her a small nod, and she returned it, one soldier to another, generations apart but bound by the same thread. As the ceremony continued, and as the new banner bearing his name rippled in the wind above the quad, Joseph stood quietly and thought of the jungle, of the heat, of the shadows that once swallowed him whole. And he thought of the young man he'd carried through the trees, who now wore 4 stars on his shoulders and had returned to salute him, not out of obligation, but out of memory. That was the legacy. Not the building, not the speeches, not even the plaque. The legacy lived in the lives that had come home because he had once gone forward alone. The jungle had let him go. And now, at last, so had the silence. Long before the words, honor, and legacy, were printed on banners or etched in marble, they had been written in sweat and sealed in blood. Joseph Grant had never chased medals. He had never chased rank. What he chased, what he lived for, was the mission, the team, and the code that had no uniform but lived in the marrow of every soldier who truly understood what it meant to serve. Now, as he stood at the heart of Westbrook's centennial celebration, a place that had once refused to even acknowledge his existence, the air thick with reverence and the sound of salutes still echoing behind him, Joseph felt the weight of every sacrifice that had come before this day. Not just his own, but the ones who didn't make it back. The ones whose names weren't even whispered. The applause had faded. The speeches had slowed. The banner bearing his name flapped gently in the morning breeze, a deep blue rectangle stitched with gold lettering, glowing softly under the rising sun. The Joseph Grant Training Center. It was a gesture, a tribute, a correction, but to Joseph, it was also something more complicated. He had never needed his name on a wall to feel worthy. But now that it was there, it forced him to confront a truth he had long buried, that too much of his story had been left in the dark, not by accident, but by design. He had seen the eyes of the young cadets. Wide. Awestruck. Curious. Many of them were likely wondering how someone so critical to their academy's history had been forgotten. Why there were no chapters on Class Zero in their textbooks. Why Project Spectre wasn't mentioned in the curriculum. Joseph knew the answer. It was the same answer every black soldier who came before full recognition understood in his bones. When the history books were written, they were edited for comfort, not truth. And when wars were memorialized, the quiet ones, the ones who fought in silence, in secrecy, in shadows, were easy to erase. The early years of Spectre were not clean or public. They were unofficial, untraceable, often unwelcome. There were whispers in the academy back in 1961, quiet doubts among senior officers about whether a black man had any business leading the elite. Joseph had heard them all. He'd walked into rooms where conversations stopped. Sat in strategy meetings where his contributions were ignored until someone else repeated them louder. And yet, he stayed. Not because he needed their approval, but because he believed in something bigger than the room itself. He believed in the mission. And the mission didn't care what color your skin was. The jungle didn't discriminate. A bullet didn't ask for background. Survival came from precision, instinct, courage, and the kind of relentless resilience that no ceremony could fabricate. Joseph's training sessions in the woods behind Westbrook had broken many cadets, but those who emerged from them were changed forever. He taught them that combat was more than muscle. It was silence. It was patience. It was knowing when not to fire. It was carrying your wounded comrade 3 miles through swamp and mud without leaving a single footprint. It was trusting your team with your life and being worthy of that trust in return. That was what Spectre had been. Not just a unit. A mindset. A brotherhood that answered to no spotlight and saluted no cameras. And yet, as the years passed, Spectre was folded into broader programs. Its name faded. Its tactics were repackaged, rebranded, redistributed without credit. By the mid-80s, there were no more whispers of the original team. The stories were still told, but only in circles of old soldiers, and even then, names like Joseph's were often softened into myth or omitted altogether. He had become, even to those who admired him, a rumor in the roots of something far more public. And he had let it be that way. Until today. As the dignitaries returned to their seats and the ceremony continued toward its final formalities, Joseph stood near the side of the stage, just far enough to feel separate but no longer hidden. One by one, guests came to greet him. Some offered handshakes. Some, hesitant at first, offered apologies. Officers who had doubted him now approached with quiet reverence, unsure how to address a man they had once dismissed. Joseph accepted each gesture with grace, but never with indulgence. He was too seasoned for that. Too measured. He didn't need their guilt. What he appreciated, what mattered, was their change. That they now looked at him and saw a man, not a ghost. A senator with a polished smile approached next. He held out his hand with the charisma of a campaign trail, but Joseph didn't return the gesture right away. The senator cleared his throat. "Colonel Grant, I want to personally thank you for your incredible service. What you built here is, well, it's the very foundation of what we now call elite training. Truly remarkable." Joseph looked at him calmly. "With respect, Senator, I didn't build it alone. And most of the men who helped me aren't around to hear you say that." The senator shifted slightly, smile faltering. "Of course. Absolutely. Their memory is our responsibility." Joseph gave a slow nod. "Then remember them." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. The senator nodded, a little paler now, and stepped away. A few feet back, Emily Rodas watched it all unfold. Her respect for Joseph had already grown into something larger than she could articulate, but watching him now. His quiet strength, his patience, his refusal to soften the truth for the comfort of others, she felt herself standing straighter. Not out of obligation, but out of aspiration. She didn't want to become a soldier like the ones on the stage. She wanted to become a leader like the one who had stood outside the ceremony and saluted alone until the world turned toward him. As the national anthem played one last time and the flag lowered in the sharp afternoon light, Joseph finally sat down on a small bench near the hedges where his morning had begun. The noise of the crowd was distant now. What filled the air instead were the memories of brothers lost, of names never spoken, of truths buried in operations stamped, classified, and sealed for decades. But now at least, something had shifted. A door had opened. And though his name had finally found its place above a training center, Joseph knew the real banner was the one etched in the minds of those who had seen him today for who he truly was. Not a guest. Not a footnote. But the first chapter. Written in silence. Bound in sacrifice. Sealed in blood long before any flag was ever raised. The sound of the anthem faded into the solemn hum of wind across the quad, and the cadets stood motionless as the final note echoed through the chapel columns. For a moment, the silence returned, not out of confusion or formality, but out of something deeper. The entire crowd, once brimming with programmed applause and polite gestures, now waited, uncertain of what should follow. Joseph Grant, seated once again on the bench near the hedges, hadn't spoken another word since the banner was unveiled. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. Even sitting, his back straight, his cane resting lightly between his fingers, he projected the same quiet authority he had carried into every classroom, every jungle, every moment of erasure. But now, people were beginning to truly see it. From the first row, a general in full regalia slowly stood, his chest decorated with medals accumulated across decades of campaigns. He raised his hand to his brow and saluted, not with the sharpness of protocol, but with the measured weight of genuine respect. It wasn't a salute for show. It was for history. A recognition that took too long to arrive, but when it did, it landed with gravity. One by one, others began to follow. Another officer stood, then a retired Marine, then a group of cadets in the third row, each of them rising not because they had been instructed but because something inside them rose first. The tide moved inward from the perimeter. Soldiers, instructors, academy officials, all standing in reverent silence. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They stood the way soldiers do when a fallen comrade returns home after years missing in action. They stood because they now realized someone had been here all along, carrying the weight they'd never seen. Emily Rodas had never seen anything like it. She stood among her fellow cadets, her posture tall, breath held. The moment did not belong to any single generation. It belonged to the spirit of service that transcended uniforms and eras. She watched as cadets her age removed their caps and held them over their hearts. Some saluted. Others simply stood with heads bowed. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't commanded. It was organic, raw, and undeniably right. From his seat, Joseph looked out over them, not as a man hungry for validation, but as someone who had known all along that the day might never come. And now that it had, he met it not with pride, but with stillness. His eyes moved slowly across the field, taking in every bowed head, every trembling hand, every young soldier who now knew his name not because it was printed in their textbook, but because they had felt the echo of it in their bones. 2 cadets from the original cordon, lieutenants who had first turned him away, now stood near the rear of the crowd. Their faces were pale, their eyes glassy. They had crossed the space between protocol and realization, and the weight of their earlier dismissal now sat heavy on their shoulders. As if compelled by something unspoken, they stepped forward, weaving through the standing crowd, until they reached the front of the quad where Joseph sat alone. They didn't speak immediately. They didn't offer scripted apologies. They simply stood before him, the taller one breathing shallowly as if words had become too difficult to form. Finally, with a voice soft and uneven, the taller lieutenant said, "Sir, we didn't know. Truly. We didn't see you." Joseph studied them both, not unkindly. His eyes, though aged, remained sharp. He had spent a lifetime looking into the faces of young soldiers, reading fear, arrogance, guilt, courage. What he saw now was remorse, genuine and uncoached. He nodded once. A small gesture. Enough. He didn't scold them. He didn't humiliate them. Grace had always been more powerful than rebuke. "We learn when we're ready to see," Joseph said gently. "You'll remember this day. That's enough." The words hit deeper than any reprimand could have. The lieutenants nodded in return, both swallowing hard before stepping back into the crowd, changed. The superintendent stepped forward again, not to speak, but to simply take in what was unfolding. For once, he had no speech prepared, no directive. What could he add to a silence so full it felt holy? He turned and looked toward the academy tower, the banners now fluttering gently under a softer wind, as if even the sky had bent its ear to listen. One of the academy photographers, usually embedded with the press detail to capture highlight reels, raised his camera out of habit. But something made him lower it again. This wasn't a moment to document. It was a moment to feel. Even the cadets with phones in their pockets didn't reach for them. The unwritten rule of the battlefield had found its way to the ceremony: when something sacred happens, you don't film it, you live it. Joseph remained still. But in his heart, a subtle warmth began to grow. Not from recognition. From reconciliation. With time. With silence. With history. And most of all, with himself. He had come to remember. He had braced for invisibility. He hadn't expected to be surrounded by a sea of uniforms standing not in obedience, but in awe. Yet here they were, standing because something ancient had been stirred inside them. The feeling that they stood on the shoulders of someone who never asked to be seen, but had never stopped seeing them. Emily stepped forward now. Not far. Just enough so Joseph could see her clearly through the crowd. She didn't salute this time. She simply placed her hand over her heart and gave a slight nod, the kind you give a teacher, a mentor, a figure who shaped the road you now walk. Joseph returned the nod with a softness that surprised even him. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the sound of flags and the soft creak of branches overhead. The silence began to break as the ceremony resumed. But it didn't resume the same. Everything that followed now lived in the shadow of that moment, the moment when an academy stopped performing tradition and started truly honoring it. Joseph sat back against the bench and closed his eyes for a second, just to feel the sun. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like he was outside the circle. He was home. And the home remembered him. The ceremony continued in measured formality after the moment of collective silence, but everyone knew the center of gravity had shifted. The general's speech, the new banner, the standing ovation, those would be remembered, but what lingered most in the hearts of the cadets and officers was not what had been said, but what had almost been missed. At the center of it all, Joseph Grant remained on the bench near the hedges where his day had begun, his body weary but upright, his gaze steady, his presence still commanding in its quiet way. The sound of cadets reorganizing, of officials returning to their seats, buzzed faintly around him like wind brushing through tall grass. But Joseph heard something different now. A subtle rhythm in the space between moments. It was the rhythm of recognition settling in. And with it came the slow footsteps of two young men who had been waiting for the right moment to approach him again. Lieutenant James Barlow and Lieutenant Chris Meyer, the junior officers who had first turned him away at the cordon hours earlier, stood a few paces behind him now. They had been watching from a distance, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock to shame. They had saluted with the others, stood at attention with the crowd, felt their own hearts drop when the truth of Joseph's identity had been revealed. And now, as the field began to relax into the usual order of post-ceremonial protocol, they moved toward him with uncertain steps, each carrying the weight of their earlier mistake. Joseph sensed them before they spoke. He turned his head slightly, not startled, just aware. His eyes met theirs, and in them, he saw what so many veterans recognized in the young, the struggle to bridge between what they thought they knew and what they had just learned. The taller one, Barlow, cleared his throat, the sound barely audible. "Sir," he began, then hesitated. His voice was unsteady. "We owe you an apology." Joseph said nothing. He waited, his gaze not harsh, but not lenient either. Barlow took a breath. We saw the badge this morning and didn't understand what we were looking at. We followed protocol. We enforced the list. And we didn't think to ask more. We didn't think to listen. And we should have." Beside him, Meyer added, "We didn't know who you were, sir. But that doesn't change the fact that we treated you like someone who didn't belong here. That was wrong." Joseph's face was unreadable for a long moment. He let their words hang in the air, gave them room to echo and settle. Then he slowly turned his full attention to them. His eyes, aged but unblinking, held not judgment but understanding. He had seen that kind of regret before, not from malice, but from the moment when ignorance gives way to truth and leaves a scar behind. "You're right," he said at last, his voice deep and even. "You didn't know. But now you do." Barlow nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes, sir. We do. And we're sorry." Joseph studied him. "Tell me something, Lieutenant. What would you have done if I'd insisted? If I'd raised my voice, demanded entry, made a scene?" Barlow hesitated. "Honestly, sir, we probably would have called a superior and held the perimeter." "And you would have been following your orders," Joseph said. "Yes, sir," Barlow replied. "But it wouldn't have been right." Joseph nodded slowly. "That's the lesson, then. Protocol is necessary. But so is discernment. One doesn't excuse the absence of the other." Meyer looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "We should have seen it. We should have felt it." Joseph tilted his head. "You felt something. You just didn't trust it." Barlow's shoulders slumped slightly. "No one teaches us how to do that, sir." "Not really." Joseph's gaze softened. "Then you remember this moment. Because it'll teach you more than any manual you'll ever read." Both lieutenants stood quietly, taking in the weight of his words. It wasn't a lecture. It was a gift, a moment of grace from a man who had every right to offer silence instead. Joseph leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the top of his cane. "You've seen what happens when a name isn't in the system. But history doesn't always come with a barcode. Sometimes it comes with scars. Sometimes it walks slow. Sometimes it wears a coat older than you. That doesn't mean it doesn't belong." Barlow swallowed hard, eyes flicking to the patch still visible on Joseph's coat pocket. "Thank you for letting us apologize, sir." "And for not," he trailed off, unsure how to end the sentence. Joseph finished it for him. "For not making you feel smaller than your mistake." Meyer looked up, eyes glassy. "Yes, sir. That." Joseph gave the faintest smile, one that barely moved his lips but changed everything in the lines of his face. "The only thing smaller than a mistake is the man who refuses to learn from it. I think you'll both turn out just fine." The two young men stood in silence, then offered one more salute. Joseph returned it slowly, then turned his gaze back toward the quad, signaling gently that the moment had passed. They backed away with quiet reverence, rejoining the gathering still buzzing with the weight of the morning. As they walked off, Emily Rodas approached from the other side, keeping her distance at first, observing the encounter with silent admiration. She waited until the lieutenants were out of earshot before stepping closer. "You handled that with more patience than most people would have, sir," she said. Joseph didn't turn. He just watched the flag sway in the wind. They were doing what they were taught. That's not the problem. The problem is what they weren't taught. Emily nodded slowly. "I think they learned it today." "We all did." Joseph glanced at her. "Then it was worth coming." She smiled softly. "It was more than worth it." And for the first time that day, Joseph leaned back against the bench, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. The apology had been offered, accepted, and more importantly, it had become a lesson, a moment of transformation in two young officers who would carry that day with them into every post, every mission, every decision. Because sometimes, the most profound change doesn't come from a reprimand. It comes from being seen, being corrected, and being forgiven. And that was what Joseph Grant had always done best. Train warriors, yes. Build tactics, yes. But more than that, he built character. Even in silence. Even after being forgotten. Especially then. As the final echoes of the ceremony's speeches died down, the Westbrook parade grounds began to settle into a reverent quiet. The sun now hung at a modest angle, casting long shadows across the quad. Cadets were dismissed in soft waves, dignitaries politely escorted to reception halls, and staff members began to disassemble chairs with mechanical efficiency. But amidst the routine ebb of post-ceremonial order, one gesture unfolded that no one had anticipated, a banner rising silently, like memory itself, into the breeze. From the flagpole nearest the Academy's eastern arch, two cadets worked with quiet precision to unfurl a new banner. It had not been listed in the official program, nor announced from the stage, and yet as it rose, everyone who remained on the grounds turned instinctively to witness it. The fabric was a deep, regal navy blue, and across it in bold gold stitching were the words, "The Joseph Grant Training Center, EST 2024. It fluttered slightly as it caught the wind, its edges crisp, its meaning heavy. Standing at the edge of the field, Joseph watched as the banner rose, his eyes fixed on it not with pride, but with something deeper, an understanding that he had, at last, been acknowledged in a way that transcended speeches and uniforms. Emily stood beside him, saying nothing, simply letting the moment breathe. No applause came this time. No dramatic salute or loud announcement. Just silence, reverence, and wind. From the sidelines, Major General Reed stepped toward the microphone one last time. His voice was steadier than before, no longer burdened by the pressure of ceremony, but guided now by humility. "Today," he said, "we were reminded that not all who shape history wear stars on their collars. Some leave their mark in footsteps too quiet for microphones, but too deep to fade." He gestured subtly toward the banner. "Let it be known that our legacy is not bound to the pages of a registry, but lives in the actions of those who served without demand for recognition." Joseph felt something shift in the air around him. It wasn't simply about being honored, it was about no longer having to explain. About not having to insist or plead for a place. The banner wasn't a tribute to his rank or medals. It was a symbol of memory made visible. Of a legacy no longer hidden in dusty files or forgotten missions. For the first time in decades, the institution had turned to face him. Emily looked at him, her voice low. They'll pass under that name every day. The cadets. The instructors. The future. Joseph nodded slowly. And most of them won't know who I was. Not fully. She replied gently, but some will ask. And a few will care enough to learn. Nearby, a small group of cadets gathered without instruction, standing at attention as the banner fully unfurled. One of them, a young private with broad shoulders and a face barely past 17, whispered something to the cadet beside him. That's the man. The other nodded. Colonel Grant. Class 0. The younger cadet straightened a bit more. Joseph watched them with quiet observation. He didn't need fanfare. He didn't need flashbulbs or podiums. All he had ever wanted was for the sacrifice to be remembered, for those who came after to understand the ground they marched on had been earned, not gifted. He had never sought credit. Only continuity. As the wind pulled at his coat gently, Joseph felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Superintendent Reed himself, now without his formal cap, his posture more that of a man than a rank. Colonel Grant, he said respectfully, we would be honored if you would permit us to name a lecture series after you as well. For the Advanced Leadership Training Program. Field Integrity, Ethics in Command, and Crisis Discipline. You've embodied all three. Joseph looked at him, then at the banner. That would be fine, General. So long as they're told the truth. Not just the shiny parts. Reed nodded. The truth is what brought us here today. We won't forget it again. Joseph looked out across the field once more, now emptying of its ceremony but filled with something else, awareness. Memory. Gratitude. He felt the wind pull a little stronger now, carrying the scent of grass and old stone and uniforms pressed too tightly. It smelled like home. Like sacrifice and survival and history folded into the land. A junior cadet approached, carrying a small wooden plaque wrapped in navy ribbon. With trembling hands, he offered it to Joseph. Sir, the cadet said, this is yours. Joseph took the plaque, unwrapped it slowly. Burned into the wood were the same words from the banner, along with a line in smaller script, in silence, he served. In legacy, he remains. Joseph exhaled, long and slow. His fingers brushed over the carving as if reading it through time. Thank you, son, he said, his voice quieter now, edged with the fatigue of memory. But this isn't mine alone. It belongs to those who didn't come back. The ones we lost in Korea, and Cambodia, and in the jungles no one mentions anymore. The cadet stood straight, swallowing hard. We won't forget them either, sir. Emily stepped beside Joseph again and offered her arm. Shall we find you a seat up front? He chuckled softly. I think I've earned a front row this time. They walked slowly across the quad, every eye watching, not with curiosity, but with reverence. Cadets paused as they passed. Officers stepped aside. Even the maintenance crews stood still. No one told them to. It just felt right. When Joseph reached the seat bearing his name, reserved, Colonel J. Grant, Class 0, he sat with dignity. The plaque rested gently in his lap. His cane leaned against the chair's arm. His shoulders squared. And though the speeches were done, though the cameras had stopped rolling and the dignitaries had all returned to their polished halls, Joseph Grant knew something rare had just occurred. Not a tribute. Not a decoration. But a correction. The truth, once hidden, now stood in the open air, printed on cloth, etched in wood, and planted in the heart of an academy that had finally remembered where it came from. Above him, the banner rippled with a soft rustle. A new legacy had taken root. Not loud, not boastful. Just steady. Just seen. The sun began to descend, casting golden hues across the Westbrook campus, bathing the grounds in a soft glow that blurred the line between present and past. As the remaining guests filtered away and the grounds grew quieter, Joseph Grant remained seated in his front row chair beneath the newly raised banner that bore his name. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence alone now carried the weight of 100 forgotten stories. Emily Rhodes lingered nearby, not out of duty but choice. She could have joined the other cadets for the debrief and final salute, but something in her said this moment wasn't done yet. She wasn't done yet. She stepped closer, her posture respectful but relaxed, and asked gently, "Colonel, do you mind if I sit?" Joseph looked over and nodded, motioning to the chair beside him with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too many years to be surprised by kindness. She sat, folding her hands in her lap. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was thick with thought, with the kind of mutual recognition that spanned generations, uniforms, and unspoken truths. After a moment, she spoke. "I've read more about Project Spectre since this morning. It wasn't easy to find anything, but I found mentions in declassified memos. Just fragments. It wasn't a myth." Joseph gave a half-smile, his eyes still fixed on the field ahead. "It wasn't meant to be found. We weren't building heroes. We were buying time. Holding lines no one knew existed. Spectre wasn't about medals. It was about staying unseen." Emily nodded slowly. "But it shaped what we are now. Every special tactics class we take, every covert operations drill, it all started with the doctrine you and your team wrote in the dirt and blood." Joseph turned his head just slightly, enough to catch her eyes. "That's the thing, Lieutenant. Doctrine is easy to teach. What they don't teach is when to listen to your gut." Emily swallowed hard, remembering how she'd noticed him earlier, how easy it would have been to turn away like the others did. She asked, "How did you know, back then? When you were out there, when things went south, how did you decide what to do?" Joseph leaned on his cane, thinking for a long moment. "You don't always know. You guess. You learn the rhythm of chaos. And you look out for the man next to you. That's what they won't teach you in the classroom. In the jungle, in the cold, when you're moving through the dark and the radios go quiet, it's not the manuals you remember. It's the man beside you, the promise you made to him." Emily let that sink in. She had memorized field manuals, passed every tactical exam, aced every exercise. But in Joseph's words, she saw something deeper than knowledge. She saw the wisdom of having lived the very scenarios others only simulated. "Do you ever regret coming back?" she asked. Joseph chuckled softly, not bitterly, just thoughtfully. "Sometimes. When you're forgotten, it feels like you were never there. Like none of it mattered. But today, something changed. And not just for me." Emily looked down, her voice quieter. "I almost didn't speak up. I almost listened to protocol. But something about you. I couldn't ignore it." Joseph gave a small nod of approval. "Good. Trust that instinct. Don't let brass or systems teach it out of you. The best decisions I ever made were the ones I wasn't sure about but felt in my bones." They sat together as the last rays of sunlight kissed the banner above them. A few cadets in the distance continued packing equipment, their chatter muffled by the wind. Joseph turned to her again. "You'll make a damn fine leader one day. But don't let them turn you into just a rank." Emily smiled, not in pride, but in understanding. "I won't, sir." Joseph's expression softened. "And remember, when the world forgets people like me, it's folks like you who bring us back. Not with parades. With memory." A familiar voice called from the chapel steps, "Major General Reed." He waved gently toward Joseph and Emily, signaling it was time to head inside for the private dinner arranged in Joseph's honor. But Joseph didn't move. Not yet. He looked at the cadets still bustling in the field. Looked at the tower where he once stood guard as a boy. Looked at the oak tree he remembered planting drills around in the rain. He reached into his coat and pulled out the old cracked ID badge again, holding it between his fingers, running a thumb across the faded image of a young black cadet with wide eyes and squared shoulders. "You know," he said to Emily, "this piece of plastic once opened every door here. Then one day, it didn't open anything. And now," he glanced up at the banner again, "now it doesn't need to." Emily helped him to his feet, and they stood there together one last time in the silence that followed. She asked softly, "Do you want me to take you in, sir?" Joseph shook his head. "I'll walk it myself. Feels right." She stepped aside but kept close, just in case. As he walked slowly toward the chapel steps, the cadets nearby stopped and turned, recognizing the silhouette now burned into their memory. Some saluted. Others placed hands over hearts. No one spoke. They didn't have to. Joseph Grant climbed those steps with his cane in one hand, the plaque tucked under his arm, and a lifetime of stories in his heart. Emily followed him, eyes sharp, posture proud, knowing this wasn't just about honoring the past, it was about learning how to carry it. As they reached the doors, Joseph paused one last time, looked back at the quad, and whispered more to himself than anyone else, "What they don't teach in doctrine is how to be remembered. But today, you all just did." Then he stepped inside, where a warm room and 1,000 silent salutes waited. The dining hall inside Westbrook's officer quarters had never been so quiet. The long oak tables were set with polished silverware and crystal glasses, flickering with soft candlelight. Distinguished guests filled every seat, generals, academy board members, political appointees, yet no one dominated the room more than the man who entered slowly on a wooden cane, his steps deliberate, his presence undeniable. Joseph Grant, a name most of them hadn't heard before this morning, now echoed silently in their minds like a forgotten hymn suddenly remembered. The seats closest to the head of the table had been reserved, and Joseph was guided there with gentle reverence. He did not hurry. He did not stumble. With each step, he seemed to remind the room of something they'd all lost and perhaps weren't brave enough to admit: legacy isn't written in textbooks or programs, it's lived, and often forgotten. General Leland rose from his chair as Joseph approached. With no need for introduction, he simply extended his hand. "Colonel Grant," he said firmly, "welcome home." Joseph shook it, nodding once. "Feels different. But it still smells like sweat and gun oil." There were light chuckles, but no one missed the emotion behind the humor. Leland gestured to the seat beside him. Joseph took it, resting his cane carefully against the edge of the table. As the staff began to serve, the murmur of conversation resumed, but with a more subdued tone than usual. People glanced toward Joseph repeatedly, some in awe, others in quiet discomfort, knowing they had celebrated a century of excellence without ever knowing the man who helped build the first foundation. Emily Rhodes, seated 2 spots down, watched carefully. She had taken a notebook from her pocket and jotted a few words during the walk earlier. Now, she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd write next. It was no longer about duty. It was about truth. General Leland tapped his glass gently. "Before we begin, I'd like to propose a moment of gratitude. Not a speech, just a moment. To honor the man without whom many of us would not be sitting here. Joseph Grant didn't just serve. He trained, bled, and stood tall when no one remembered his name. He reminds us that valor often lives in silence. And sometimes, silence needs to be broken." Everyone lifted their glasses. Some drank. Joseph only nodded. He didn't need the toast. He had lived the truth. As the courses continued, prime rib, roasted vegetables, red wine, an old man named Colonel Winters, seated across from Joseph, cleared his throat. "I served in Vietnam," he began, "and I thought I'd seen most of the legends. But I never heard of Project Spectre. Why keep it buried so long?" Joseph took a slow breath, placing his fork down. Because some things aren't meant to be paraded. They're meant to be endured. Spectre wasn't a medal mission. It was a necessity. When the doctrine didn't exist, we had to become it. And when it was over, we were told to disappear so others could build safely. But you saved lives, another voice added. You shaped generations. Joseph looked down at his gnarled hands. So did a lot of men. Most of them didn't come home. Some were never even named. I'm just the one still walking. The room fell silent again, not in pity, but in profound respect. The kind that comes only when the weight of history sits at your table. One of the younger officers at the far end of the table raised his voice hesitantly. Sir, if I may ask, did they ever offer you a medal for what you did in Cambodia? That rescue? Joseph looked up slowly, eyes steady. They offered silence. Said acknowledging it might compromise ongoing operations. Said it wasn't about recognition. They were right. Mostly. But every man I pulled out of that jungle. I see them in my dreams. That's enough of a medal. General Leland leaned forward. But it wasn't right. And that's why today matters. Not just for you, but for everyone who was told their sacrifice wasn't the right kind of story. Emily's voice broke through, clear and steady. Sir, with respect. I think we've honored you with words. But I believe the Academy should go further. We need your story in our curriculum. In every leadership class. In every doctrine briefing. If we teach history, we should teach the truth. Several heads nodded. Even those who had once hesitated were now considering it deeply. Joseph looked over at her, a soft smile forming. Careful, Lieutenant. You keep that up, and they'll start calling buildings after you too. The room finally laughed, a warm, genuine sound that released some of the tension. Emily didn't laugh though. She met his gaze with full seriousness. No, sir. I want them to remember you. Because legacy isn't real unless it's passed on. General Reed rose now, holding a small box in both hands. Colonel Grant, he said, walking over, we can't undo the silence. But we can end it. He opened the box and revealed an aged but gleaming medal, the Distinguished Service Cross. Not new, this was from the era in which Joseph should have received it. We petitioned the Department of the Army last year after discovering field reports. It took some strings, and it took some truth. But it's yours now. Official. Permanent. The medal was placed before Joseph. He didn't touch it. Not yet. He looked around the room. I didn't come for this, he said quietly. I came to remember. But I'll accept it, not for me. For the ones whose names are still locked in the shadows. He finally reached forward, took the medal, and cradled it in his palm like a fallen comrade. Emily whispered softly to herself, honor doesn't shout. It stands quietly until the world remembers. The room didn't applaud. No one needed to. It was a sacred moment, and some things are better left in silence, where they echo the loudest. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the courtyard as cadets filtered out of the grand hall, their dress uniforms catching streaks of gold light. A hush had fallen over the campus, not from fatigue but reverence. Word had traveled faster than any official broadcast. Not about the ceremony or the generals, but about the old black man with a cane who had stood taller than anyone else that day. Joseph Grant wasn't just a relic of the past anymore. He had become the living memory of it. Cadet Lieutenant Emily Rhodes waited by the edge of the stage, her hands tucked behind her back, her jaw tight with something she couldn't name. The conversations that had followed the dinner still echoed in her head. The medal. The salute. The raw truth that history had hidden someone like Joseph in the folds of bureaucracy. She had seen something that day most of her peers might never witness again. A man stepping out from the footnotes of history and into the center of a nation's conscience. And now, it wasn't over. Not yet. Across the courtyard, Joseph stood beneath an old stone arch, his fingers grazing a weather-worn plaque he had once helped install nearly 70 years ago. His eyes traced the chiseled names of cadets long gone, names he remembered not from paper, but from shared foxholes, from cold nights on perimeter watch, from prayers whispered before impossible missions. He felt the breeze tug at his coat and the weight of 1,000 memories settle over his shoulders like the medals he'd never worn. General Leland approached quietly from behind. No guards, no aides, just him. He stopped beside Joseph, nodding toward the arch. "You helped build this?" Joseph's voice was soft but sure. "Laid the first stones myself. We didn't have machines back then, just shovels, sweat, and too much time on our hands." Leland smiled faintly. "Funny. We've walked past this 100 times and never knew who we owed it to." Joseph didn't look away. "That's the nature of foundation. It holds you up, but no one thinks about it unless it cracks." They stood in silence for a while, the wind shifting just enough to rustle the old flag above them. Then Leland turned slightly. The board met. They voted unanimously. The main hall will be renamed, the Joseph Grant Training Center. Your story will be taught in the leadership course starting this fall. Full honors. Full integration into the curriculum. Joseph's lips pressed into a thoughtful line. "You sure you want to put my name up in stone? People will ask questions. Questions the textbooks don't like to answer." Leland folded his arms. "Good. Maybe it's time the textbooks got uncomfortable. Maybe it's time cadets learn that legacy isn't always neat or officially recorded." Joseph chuckled once, low and warm. "Careful, General. You sound like a young man. Maybe that's what happens when old soldiers remind us how to lead." Behind them, a small group of cadets approached in formation, not official orders, just instinct. They weren't there to practice drills or perform ceremonies. They simply stood nearby, quietly acknowledging the presence of a man whose shadow stretched farther than the tallest tower on campus. Emily walked ahead of them, stopping a respectful distance away. "Sir," she said, looking at Joseph, "we reserved a seat for you." He tilted his head. "A seat?" "At the front row," she replied. "Tomorrow morning's final cadet formation. We'll be raising a new flag under your name. You'll be leading the ceremony." Joseph looked back toward the parade ground, that sacred square where he had once marched under different orders, different flags, in a world that hadn't yet made space for someone like him. Now he was being offered the center. He nodded once, slowly. "I'll be there. But only if I can walk across the field." Emily blinked. "You want to march?" "Don't need to march. Just walk it. Like I did all those years ago. Before the cameras. Before the medals." General Leland looked at Emily. "Make it happen. No escort. No pageantry. Just Colonel Grant crossing the quad. The rest of us will follow." That evening, the cadets spent hours preparing the space, repainting the flagpole base, realigning the seats, and carefully adjusting the old campus lights to spotlight a new plaque that had been rushed into engraving. Emily stood at the printing lab until after midnight, reviewing line by line the speech she would deliver. She didn't want it to sound like tribute. She wanted it to sound like justice. At dawn, as mist rolled in from the hills, Joseph stood just beyond the parade ground. No cane this time. He had left it at the edge of the chapel steps. His posture was imperfect, but he stood with a dignity that made the imperfections disappear. The cadets stood in full formation, eyes forward, silence deep and wide. The band held its breath. The commandant stood beside Leland, arms crossed, waiting. Then Joseph took the first step onto the field. His shoes crunched faintly over the gravel path, and every head turned to watch. He didn't rush. Each step was a story. Each breath a tribute. Each glance around the field a page turned. When he reached the center of the quad, he paused. Slowly, he raised his hand in a perfect salute. This time, thousands returned it, cadets, officers, faculty, even groundskeepers, standing straighter than they ever had before. It wasn't a command. It was instinct. It was right. As he lowered his hand, Emily stepped forward to the microphone. "Cadets of Westbrook," she said, her voice steady, "you've studied maps, tactics, doctrine, and leadership. But today, you've witnessed the most important lesson of all. That legacy isn't given. It's earned. And sometimes, it walks among us quietly, waiting for the world to see." She turned toward Joseph. "This academy stands because you did. Today, we see you. And we won't forget again." As the flag was raised, now stitched with the words, "Joseph Grant Training Center," the sun broke through the mist, flooding the courtyard with a golden light that felt like history waking up. Joseph closed his eyes, not to shut it out, but to hold it inside. This time, the world remembered. Years had passed since that unforgettable morning at Westbrook. The training grounds had changed. New wings had been added to the dormitories. The simulation labs were state-of-the-art, and satellite-linked helmets now replaced paper field maps. But one thing remained untouched. The arch at the entrance to the Joseph Grant Training Center. Every cadet passed beneath it, often without knowing the full story of the man whose name was etched in steel above their heads. They read the plaque out of habit, some pausing for a second, some never at all. Yet once a year, on a gray morning in early spring, the academy gathered at dawn. No speeches, no banners, just silence. Reverent. It was tradition now, but not the kind born of ceremony. It was the kind that lived in the marrow of the place. Colonel Emily Rhodes stood by the edge of the field, her black boots damp with morning dew. Her uniform had changed over the years, now sharper, adorned with service ribbons and accolades, but her eyes still held the same intensity she had when she was a cadet. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with threads of gray. She wasn't the same woman who once spotted an old man sitting by the hedges. She was something more. Not because of the rank she'd earned, but because of the legacy she now carried. She turned toward the cadets assembled before her, the new class, green and eager. Most didn't yet understand what it meant to be shaped by the ghosts who walked before them. But they would. Not through textbooks or training exercises, but through memory. Through truth. A small honor detail stood behind her, surrounding the black pedestal that held Joseph Grant's cane, preserved in a glass case, never polished, the rubber tip still bearing the scar of that long walk across the quad. At exactly 0700, the bell at Westbrook's chapel rang once. The cadets saluted. Emily stepped forward. She didn't read from a script. She never did on this day. Some of you may be wondering why we stand here every year, without the brass bands, without the cameras. It's because this isn't about performance. It's about presence. There was once a man who walked this very ground before you were born. He didn't wear medals, didn't seek attention. He walked alone, not to be seen, but to remember. She glanced at the sky, then continued. Colonel Joseph Grant was here before there was Wi-Fi or GPS. Before uniform equality. Before the words diversity and leadership meant anything real. He was here when the concrete was still wet and the towers were scaffolding. He didn't just help build this academy. He was this academy. Her voice didn't rise in volume, but it deepened in weight. He was turned away at the gate, not because of malice, but because of forgetfulness. And that is what we fight most today, not just threats abroad, but memory. Memory is our greatest weapon. Or our deepest failure. She looked out over the silent rows of cadets. You are the future of this country's defense. But defense means more than bullets and orders. It means guarding the truth, especially when no one else does. It means remembering the man who sat on a stone planter, waiting for the world to realize who he was. From the back of the formation, an older man stepped forward slowly. A retired major, now in his 70s, wearing a faded Westbrook pin. He had been one of the lieutenants who turned Joseph away that day. His face, lined with time, was steady now. He walked toward the cane, removed his cover, and bowed his head. No one had asked him to. It was just something he had to do every year. When he looked up, Emily gave a single nod. She remembered the apology. The way Joseph had accepted it with grace, not bitterness. Later that day, cadets would walk through the Grant Center Central Hall. On the far wall hung the only photograph ever found of Joseph Grant in uniform, black and white, blurred at the edges, but unmistakably him. Beside it was a bronze plaque with just 2 sentences engraved. I didn't come to be seen. I thank you for remembering. In the quiet hours after the ceremony, Emily walked the grounds alone. She always did. Past the chapel, past the mess hall, to the small bench near the north field where Joseph used to sit on his visits. The bench was old now, the wood worn smooth from time and weather, but the brass plate affixed to the back still gleamed, reserved, Colonel J. Grant, Class 0. She sat there, letting the wind brush against her uniform. She looked out over the field and imagined Joseph there again, older, yes, but strong in spirit. She imagined him standing in the cold, saluting alone, before the world caught up. A young cadet jogged by and stopped, noticing her. "Colonel Rhodes," he said, catching his breath. "Permission to speak?" "Go ahead, cadet." "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for today's ceremony. I didn't know the full story until now. It kind of changes how I see things." Emily offered a small smile. "That's the idea. You'll carry it forward, right?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Always." She nodded back. "That's how we keep him alive." That evening, in a quiet moment inside the Grant Center, a maintenance worker dimmed the hallway lights. He passed under the old photograph, paused, and saluted. He wasn't military. He had never worn a uniform. But his father had. And his father used to tell him stories of men like Joseph Grant. Men who didn't need headlines to shape history. Just presence. Just purpose. Just one moment that reminded the world what honor really looked like. Outside, the flag swayed gently in the night breeze. Beneath it, engraved in stone, were the words added just last year: "Honor doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It just stands steady, until the world remembers." And Westbrook would always remember. Because Joseph Grant no longer stood alone. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?